He's a killing machine. A prosecutor said, "I don't think I have ever seen or heard of anybody who more thoroughly embodied more of what we think of as evil than Kenneth McDuff." John Moriarty, chief investigator for the Texas Department of Corrections, put it, "Kenneth is the only man in Texas history to have been sentenced to death for murder, paroled, arrested again, and convicted of murder, and then sent back to death row a second time." On March 21, 1946, Kenneth was born into a wealthy family in Rosebud, a town in central Texas. His father, John Allen, was a Freemason who had already built up a fortune in the concrete business before the construction boom of the 1960s. His mother, Addie, was a homemaker. Born the second to last child in the family, Kenneth never lacked for his family's affection from an early age, especially from his mother, Addie. Whatever his siblings had, Kenneth had to have. Whatever others didn't have, whenever he opened his mouth, Addie would unconditionally satisfy his demands. Growing up in such an environment, Kenneth gradually became accustomed to everything going his way. It was as natural to him as breathing. He never imagined air could run out. He was a hothouse orchid, bloated on attention, until the day the glass shattered. When things didn't go his way, he would become volatile and aggressive. This frequently happened when he was at school. After Kenneth entered Rosebud High School, because of his unpredictable character and what Addie did, his reputation became very bad. On the surface, Addie was a kind homemaker, but in reality, she was a woman with a violent temper. Once, because of some trivial matters, the school bus driver kicked Kenneth's twin brother, Lonnie, off the bus. When Addie learned of this, she didn't call the school to complain, nor did she seek out the principal to reason with him. She went directly to the bus driver with a gun. No one knows exactly what she said, but from then on, the bus drivers became extremely polite whenever they saw children from their family, and Addie earned herself a nickname, the Pistol-Packing Mama. Because of this nickname, Kenneth was frequently mocked by students his age, saying he was a spoiled child of a rich mother, a child of wealthy people. Over time, Kenneth responded to the verbal attacks from those students by finding Tommy, the kind of boy who was good at sports, had many friends, and was liked by teachers, and they got into a fight. However, Kenneth lost, and lost badly. Before graduating from high school, Kenneth went to work at his father's company doing manual labor. At that time, it was the 1960s, and Kenneth's father, John, was running a company related to the construction industry during the Texas construction boom. That period was Kenneth's favorite time. Even later, when he was interviewed in prison, he would always talk about those days. He said, "Those old ladies just loved the way I mowed their grass. Others were jealous." No one knows whether those old ladies' praise was real, but later records show that while he was boasting about his gardening skills, a series of burglary cases were occurring one after another in Bell County, Milam County, and Falls County. In 1964, when he was 18 years old, he was sentenced by the court for 12 counts of burglary and attempted burglary, each carrying a 4-year sentence to be served concurrently. In other words, for a young man who had just become an adult, that was a long time. However, Kenneth did not take this sentence very seriously. In December 1965, Kenneth was granted parole and returned to society early, and shortly after his release, however, he was imprisoned again for fighting. At this time, Kenneth was still just a burglar and a brawler in police records. He hadn't taken any lives, but one of his associates knew more. Roy Green later became his accomplice. He said that Kenneth loved to boast at that time, saying that he had committed far more crimes than were recorded in his file, saying that he had raped and killed 2 young women. No one knew whether what he said was true or false, but 1 year later, in 1966, the occurrence of a triple murder case made everyone have to take a fresh look at this young man. August 6, 1966, Kenneth and Green had spent all day working at a construction site, pouring concrete for Kenneth's father's company. A month earlier, Kenneth and Green had met each other through an acquaintance. The two were not close friends, but they were close enough to pass time together. After finishing work, they decided to head to Fort Worth to find something to do. Around 10 o'clock at night, after the party ended, the two were driving around aimlessly in a Dodge car, and then they drove to the local high school. Kenneth said he was looking for a girl. Green did not ask who she was, but before long, Kenneth pulled over near a local baseball field. There were 3 young people standing beside a Ford car, smoking and chatting. They were 17-year-old Robert and his 16-year-old girlfriend Sullivan, 15-year-old Mark. While they were chatting, they did not notice that a car had quietly stopped 150 yards away. Kenneth took out a .38 Colt revolver, and as he got out of the car, he told Green, "Pick up the cane and come with me." Immediately after, they walked one after another toward the 3 young people. Kenneth raised the gun and shouted, "Hand over your wallets or I'll shoot." Even after getting the wallets, however, Kenneth still ordered them to hand over the car keys and made them climb into the trunk of the Ford car. He said to Green, "I have to kill them." He drove the Ford car onto the highway, while Green followed behind in the Dodge car. Shortly after, they left the highway and stopped in a field by the roadside. The leader of the crime, Kenneth, opened the trunk and said, "I'm going to let this young lady out." He forcibly pulled Sullivan out of the trunk and signaled Green to lock her in the Dodge car. In the trunk of the Ford car, the 2 young people knelt and begged for mercy, pleading with Kenneth to spare their lives, but Kenneth had already raised his gun. He first fired 2 shots at Robert, then fired 4 shots at Mark. Then he turned and instructed Green, "Go, take that boy's shirt to wipe the fingerprints off the Ford car." After killing the 2 boys and cleaning up the fingerprints, Kenneth drove with Sullivan and Green to another secluded location. There, although Green later claimed he was forced, he and Kenneth together carried out hours of gang rape and torture on Sullivan. When they were finished, Kenneth asked Green for something that could strangle a person to death. Green unbuckled his own belt and handed it over, but Kenneth did not take it. He took out a 3-foot-long broomstick from the Dodge car. He first choked Sullivan's neck, then used the broomstick to break her neck. In the end, Sullivan's body, which had suffered hours of torture, was casually thrown into the bushes by him. Killed 3 young people, Kenneth felt no fear whatsoever. He drove to a gas station in Hillsborough, dozens of miles away, where he bought 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. The next day, after waking up, Kenneth buried the murder gun in the dirt beside the garage at Green's house. However, Green had not slept well the previous night. After worrying all night, he got up and found Richard's parents and told them exactly what Kenneth had made him do. Richard was the friend who had connected him with Kenneth. Upon hearing the news of the loss of 3 young lives, Richard's parents did not immediately call the police. They first passed the information on to Kenneth's mother, Addie, the mother who had always spoilt Kenneth. No matter how much she loved her child, knowing what her son had done, she could no longer change what had already happened. In the end, Kenneth and Green were arrested. Their trial came quickly. Kenneth was sentenced to death, while Green, having become the prosecution's main witness, was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Kenneth was sent to death row in Huntsville, where he remained safe and sound for 6 years. So why and on what basis could a criminal who had committed murder have his death sentence changed to life imprisonment and then leave death row without escaping? The reason he only spent 6 years on death row was that in 1972, the United States Supreme Court made a historic ruling in a consolidated case. They ruled that imposing the death penalty without first taking into account the nature of the crime and the characteristics of the defendant constituted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Constitution. In the end, all death penalty executions nationwide were suspended, and the death sentences of 629 death row inmates, including 88 death row inmates in Texas, were all commuted to life imprisonment. Later on, Kenneth's parents made many efforts for Kenneth's parole release. In addition to Addie's concern, John provided funding throughout the entire process to find ways to get Kenneth paroled. In 1977, they spent money to hire lawyers, gathered materials, and wrote multiple letters to the parole board claiming Kenneth was innocent. In 1981, they attempted to use $10,000 to bribe a man named Glenn, one of the members of the parole board, to pave the way for Kenneth's parole application. However, Glenn immediately reported this matter, and Kenneth was sentenced to an additional 2 years in prison for it. The ultimate reason why Kenneth was granted parole was the corruption within the parole system. When the time came to 1987, as everyone knows, in the 1980s, Texas prisons were already severely overcrowded, with an average of 2 to 3 prisoners housed in a single cell. So, in 1987, the prison system decided to parole 750 prisoners per week. That meant the 15 members of the parole board had to interview and review the files of at least 1,000 prisoners every 5 working days. However, even if they truly wanted to study those prisoners, the prisoners' files would only contain the most basic information. They would not record what crimes they had committed, whether theft, assault, or triple murder like Kenneth's. Prosecutor Johnston said, "They were letting everybody out. It was a travesty. It was an embarrassment, and it was wrong. People were dying in the streets because of it." In 1989, Kenneth was paroled. After spending 23 years in prison, he found a job at a gas station earning $4 per hour, and at the same time, he was taking classes at Texas State Technical College. On the surface, at least, his life appeared to be on the right track, but anyone who knew about his crimes knew that his calm never lasted long. On the 3rd day after his release, a woman named Parker died. This 29-year-old woman died in Temple, 48 miles south of Waco. Her body was not found until October 14th. Soon after, he violated his parole terms in Rosebud and was sent back to prison for making death threats against a black teenager, as well as for public intoxication and driving under the influence. This time, Addie still loved her child as always. She took out $2,200 and gave it to 2 lawyers in Huntsville, hoping they would assess whether her child could be paroled again. In the end, on December 18, 1990, Kenneth was paroled once more. October 10, 1991, Brenda was standing on a street corner in Waco. She was an experienced sex worker who knew how to spot danger, but Kenneth's appearance and manner were no different from any other client. Until Kenneth roughly tied her up with rope, and she finally realized she had been kidnapped. Before long, Kenneth stopped the car because 3 police officers were checking vehicles on the road. Soon, one of the officers noticed Kenneth and walked over. At that moment, in order to be rescued, Brenda began kicking the rear windshield, even nearly shattering it. However, when the officer called for his colleagues to come over and drew his pistol, signaling Kenneth to get out of the car, Kenneth simply started the car and accelerated directly toward the 3 police officers. The 3 officers later wrote in their reports that all 3 of them had to jump aside to avoid being hit and could only watch helplessly as Kenneth drove past them, brushing by their sides. Although they reacted quickly and immediately pursued Kenneth in their patrol cars, Kenneth was a madman. In the middle of the night, he directly turned off his headlights and drove the wrong way down a one-way street. In the end, Kenneth stopped the car in the woodlands near US Route 84, where there were no lights, no witnesses, and he directly tortured Brenda to death. 5 days later, Kenneth was still in Waco. He was in a motel, where he had an argument with a woman named Moore. 21-year-old Moore was also a sex worker. However, even though they had an argument, in order to make money, she still chose to get into Kenneth's car. Beside Texas State Highway 6, there was a patch of wasteland. There, Kenneth used a pair of long nylon stockings to bind Moore's hands and feet. And her remains, like Brenda's, were missing for 7 years and were not found until 1998. December 29th, in Austin, the capital of Texas, Kenneth and an accomplice were driving around. When they passed by a car wash, they saw a woman washing her car. Then, Kenneth directly got out of the car. He walked up behind that woman, choked her throat with one hand, pulled her backward with the other hand. Colleen Reed, later the police learned her name, struggled a few times, but Kenneth's strength was too great. He directly pulled her into the back seat and drove away from the scene. This kidnapping incident occurred in broad daylight, and many people at the car wash witnessed everything with their own eyes. Based on eyewitness evidence, local police quickly confirmed Kenneth as the suspect and figured out his activity patterns, finding that he was always hanging out with a former criminal named Worley. Then, Tim, a deputy sheriff, checked Worley's file and found him to have a conversation. Although the first conversation yielded nothing, Tim noticed that Worley seemed to be hiding something, because Worley's eyes wandered when he spoke and his fingers kept trembling. But he did not press Worley for answers. He simply noted down Worley's address, and in the subsequent months, he frequently drove to find Worley, sometimes bringing Worley a cup of coffee, sometimes just sitting in the car chatting casually. Over the long period of time they spent together, Worley had grown accustomed to his presence. Finally, in April 1992, Worley called him and said, "Please come over as soon as possible. There are some things that need to be discussed." 18 minutes later, Tim arrived outside the motel where Worley was staying. Worley said that when he and Kenneth were in Austin, Kenneth had kidnapped a young girl. Then, after returning to Tim's office, he recounted the complete course of events of that day. They were just going to Austin to drive around and getting high, but when Kenneth saw Colleen, Kenneth temporarily changed their plans. He kidnapped her while Worley was responsible for driving. They first drove around the neighborhood a few times, then entered the Interstate 35. Worley saw everything happening through the rearview mirror. In the backseat of the car, Kenneth used shoelaces to bind Colleen's hands, burned her with cigarettes, sexually assaulted her. Colleen kept screaming, begging Worley to stop the car, hoping he would call the police. When Tim asked Worley why he didn't seek help or try to help her, he said he was very afraid because Kenneth was in the back seat, because Kenneth had a gun in his hand. As the car drove to Bell County, Kenneth dragged Colleen out of the car, beat her until she collapsed on the ground, then stuffed her into the trunk. What happened in the end, Worley did not know, because Kenneth first drove him home, but he believed that Kenneth definitely killed and buried Colleen somewhere in Bell County. Long before investigators found Worley, Kenneth had already committed 2 more murders on his own. February 24th, 1992, a sex worker named Joshua knocked on Kenneth's door. No one knows what happened. What can be confirmed is that on that day, she was killed by Kenneth. The next victim was 22-year-old Melissa. She was working at a fast food restaurant in Waco where Kenneth had also worked. Her body was not discovered until April 26th. Kenneth's victims were scattered across various counties in Texas, such as Waco, Bell, and Travis, but each place had its own police department, its own files. They had no unified command, and therefore the investigation became extremely difficult. It was not until someone investigated that Kenneth also had 2 federal crimes of drug trafficking and possession of illegal firearms that an arrest warrant for Kenneth was issued. 4 years before 1992, a famous true crime television program premiered. This program was called America's Most Wanted. It mainly recreated crime scenes, displayed information about wanted criminals, and called on viewers to provide clues to assist law enforcement agencies in capturing fugitives. May 1st, 1992, a man named Gary Smith was at home watching America's Most Wanted. The host was talking about a serial killer from Texas, Kenneth McDuff. However, just as Kenneth's photo was being displayed, Smith noticed that Kenneth's appearance looked very similar to his new colleague, Richard. Smith worked at a garbage collection company in Kansas City. Not long ago, Richard had become his colleague. He looked like an ordinary middle-aged man, somewhat reclusive. In order to make sure he wasn't seeing things, Smith immediately found another colleague and discussed the matter with him. After discussion, Smith called the Kansas City Police Department. Later, the police looked up information on Richard and found that he had previously been arrested for soliciting sex workers and had his fingerprints taken. Then, they compared Richard's fingerprints with Kenneth's fingerprints, and the results showed that he was Kenneth. 3 days later, a surveillance team of 6 officers arrested him. On June 26th, in McLennan County, Kenneth was found guilty of 1 count of murder. The victim was Melissa. But in Texas, conviction is only the first step. The jury still needed to decide whether Kenneth would be sentenced to life imprisonment or death. Gary, a journalist, expressed the hope he would be executed, saying, "If there has ever been a good argument for the death penalty, it's Kenneth McDuff." The following years were filled with appeals, retrials, and more appeals. Kenneth's lawyers used every legal procedure available, but they were rejected by the courts one by one. In the end, his execution date was set for November 17th, 1998. In the weeks leading up to the execution, Kenneth made one of the wisest decisions of his life. He revealed the location where Colleen was buried, allowing Colleen's family to bring her remains home, rather than letting her be buried in some unknown wilderness, together with tree roots and stones. He is buried in the Captain Joe Bird Cemetery in Huntsville, Texas, where inmates lie when their families choose not to claim them. Addie, the mother who had made his bed, cooked his meals, and washed his clothes well into his adulthood, and the rest of the family who had spent a lifetime indulging and forgiving him all refused to claim his remains. But for a man who had disappointed his family multiple times, this ending is very normal.